They were closing the casket when she leaned over me and whispered, "You have 1 week to get out." I still had the funeral program in my lap. My fingers clenched it without thinking, crushing the edge. I didn't turn. I just sat there, paralyzed, pretending I hadn't heard her, while the priest went on about peace and closure. My son, Arthur, had been gone for 33 years. A sudden heart attack, and the only person in this world who mattered to me was gone. And now I was sitting by his casket while his wife Clara, in a tailored black dress and crocodile tears, was already planning my eviction. She squeezed my shoulder after she said it, so tenderly, as if she were comforting me. I didn't move. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe. And tell me and everyone else, what is one life lesson everyone should learn before it's too late? Share it in the comments. Thank you. She stood up and moved to greet a new guest. "She's been so strong," someone behind me said, "to lose a husband at her age. I can't even imagine." I wanted to laugh, but my chest burned. I remained silent through the service, the final prayer, even as people began to head toward the reception hall. When it was time to leave, Clara made sure to help her own grandmother into the car, but left me to stand alone. I rode in Arthur's car, but she didn't say a single word. The car smelled like his cologne, and I thought maybe that would break me, but I was too busy trying to figure out what her game was. At the house, she ushered everyone inside. She gave a short speech about Arthur's strength and humor, and how much he loved his family. I stood behind the kitchen island, saying nothing. She passed out wine, made a toast, and hugged people like a widow on television. But I noticed the small things. The family photo by the staircase was gone. His military briefcase had been removed. She was already clearing him out. After everyone left, I went to my room. My room, the one I had lived in for 7 years. The door was open. My blankets were folded. The lamp on the nightstand was unplugged. I checked the dresser. Half the drawers were empty. My jewelry box was gone. The closet had boxes labeled Mom's Things. I stood there for a minute, as if my brain needed time to catch up. I walked past the kitchen. Clara was sitting at the dining room table with a glass of wine and her phone in her hand. She didn't look up. I cleared my throat. "Did you move my things?" She finally looked at me and said, "I was just organizing. There's a moving company I can call when you're ready." Then she smiled as if it were a polite offer. I asked her where my jewelry was. She told me, "Some of it is in the safe. You wouldn't want anything to go missing with people in and out." I said I never asked her to touch my things. She took a sip of her wine. "Arthur and I talked about this," she said. "It's nothing personal. We just assumed you'd want to be back with your sister. I don't have a sister. She knows this." I stared at her. "This is my house." She shrugged. "It was his house. He would have wanted us to have space to grieve." Then she picked up her phone as if I wasn't there. I walked out before I said something foolish. I went back to my room and checked the drawers again, trying to stay calm, trying to think. The box I kept under the bed was gone. I opened the closet and saw a bin marked old documents. I found my folder with old medical records, bank papers, and my passport. I kept digging, my heart racing. I couldn't find the deed, the one with my name on it. The one Arthur insisted we get together when they bought this house, and I helped with the down payment after he lost his job. That paper was supposed to be in this box. I checked it twice. Clara's voice came from down the hall. "Hey, do you want the leftover salad, or should I just toss it?" I didn't answer. My hand was shaking. The deed was gone. The next morning, the kitchen was silent. The smell of coffee already faded by the time I walked in. Clara was at the dining room table, typing on her laptop like it was any other Tuesday. She looked up and said, "Morning," just looking at some quotes for movers. I opened the refrigerator. My named containers were gone, replaced by neatly stacked Tupperware that wasn't mine. "I didn't ask for movers," I said. She smiled without looking up. "Right, but you said you wanted to handle things on your schedule. I thought this might help." She sipped her mug and clicked on something quickly. I went into the living room. My son's old recliner had been replaced by a faux leather armchair. His blanket was folded and tucked behind the television stand like a dog bed. "Where is Arthur's recliner?" I asked. She shrugged. It was old. It didn't fit the room anymore. I stared at her. It's been a week. She looked annoyed now. It's been 9 days. I'm not going to sit in a dead man's chair, Eleanor. That was the first time she'd said my name, as if it meant nothing. I turned and walked out just to breathe. I sat on the porch steps. I took out my phone and called a lawyer Arthur had recommended once when we were updating our wills. The secretary said he could see me that afternoon. I didn't tell Clara where I was going. I just left. The lawyer, Mr. Holt, remembered Arthur immediately. A stand-up guy, he said. My condolences. I told him what was happening. How Clara had told me I had to leave. How my name was on the deed, and how the document had gone missing. He asked how long I'd lived there. 7 years, I told him, since they bought it. He asked if I had a written record of paying the down payment. I told him I used a cashier's check. I still had the receipt. His eyes lit up. Then we might have something. I asked him to explain. He said that if my name was on the deed and I had proof of contribution, she couldn't force me out. Not legally, he said. He told me to find the cashier's check, and if possible, the original purchase paperwork. I thanked him and drove home, gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Clara was on the phone when I got back, pacing near the hallway. No, she doesn't know anything, she said into the phone, her voice dropping when she saw me. It's all taken care of. I walked past her and went straight to the attic. Arthur kept boxes up there from before they were married. Old school records, tax returns, moving documents. I pulled myself up, my heart pounding, and started opening boxes. Dust was everywhere. I found his college box, his military records box, and then one labeled Home Purchase. My breath caught. I pulled it out, sat on the attic floor, and started looking through it. Closing statements, homeowner's insurance, bank loan approvals, and there it was. A manila envelope with the final grant deed. I opened it and stared. My name, my signature, his signature dated, notarized, filed. I sat there for a second, letting it sink in. Clara was bluffing. Either she didn't know, or she knew, and was hoping I didn't. I tucked the folder into my coat and went downstairs. She was at the bottom of the attic stairs. Looking for something? She asked, her eyebrows raised. I looked her in the eye. Just old papers, nothing important. She gave a tight smile. Good. Wouldn't want you to get stressed out. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen, as if we hadn't just had a silent standoff. That night, I made copies of the deed and scanned them to my email. I created a folder just for the lawyer. I wasn't stupid. She thought she was winning, but now I had the upper hand. I just needed to play it carefully. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, she came in with 2 glasses of wine and said, I thought we should talk, clear the air. I took the glass but didn't drink. Well, she began, sitting on the couch across from me. I know things have been tense, but Arthur always said this house was for us, for our future family. I said nothing. She looked down at her glass. I don't want this to get ugly. I just want to move on. I glanced at her hand, her left ring finger still wearing his wedding band. She looked up. You understand, right? I asked. Have you talked to a lawyer? Her face tightened. No, I didn't think it was necessary. I smiled. Maybe you should. She narrowed her eyes for a second. She took a sip of wine. Are you threatening me, Eleanor? I smiled back. Number. Just thinking out loud. She stood up slowly. I hope we can make this easy. I nodded. Me too. She walked down the hall, glass still in hand. I waited until she was out of sight, pulled out my phone, and checked the scanned deed one more time. My name, clear as day. She thought she had me in a corner, but she had no idea what I had just found upstairs. The next morning, I printed 2 copies of the deed and put them in a sealed envelope with my lawyer's name on it. I dropped it off at his office without calling first. I told his assistant it was urgent and left before she could ask questions. Back at the house, Clara was in the garage cleaning out shelves as if she'd already moved past grieving. She looked up when I walked in. Hey, she said casually. Just tossing some junk. Hope you don't mind. I nodded and went inside, pretending not to notice that Arthur's fishing gear was gone. I went to my room, opened the top drawer of my nightstand, and found it locked. That drawer had never had a lock. I took a flathead screwdriver and pried it open. Inside, my prescription bottle was gone, and so was my small envelope of cash. She was sending a message. She wanted me to know I had no privacy anymore. I sat on the bed and breathed through my teeth until the burning in my chest passed. Then I did something I hadn't done since Arthur died. I opened his filing cabinet in the office. In the third drawer down, I found a folder labeled Refinancing Options. Inside were more recent mortgage statements with both of our names on them, dated less than a year ago. That mattered. Clara hadn't been added, not even after the refinance. I took a picture and saved it to the cloud. I heard Clara's voice in the hallway, talking to someone on speakerphone. Yeah, she's still here. I know it's awkward, but she doesn't have any real claim. A pause. No, her name isn't on any of the current bills, utilities, taxes. It's going to be fine. I stepped into the hall and made just enough noise for her to know I'd heard. She turned quickly, her eyes wide. Everything okay? She asked. I told her, you should be very careful what you say in this house. The walls are thin. Then I went back into the kitchen and started making coffee like nothing happened. She didn't bother me for the rest of the day. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, I walked past the living room and saw she'd replaced the family portrait with a landscape print. Mountains, blues, and empty snow, no people. I stared at it longer than I meant to. That night, she ordered Chinese takeout and left my portion in the bag on the counter. No note, no courtesy. I took the food, went to my room, and locked the door from the inside with the wedge I'd kept since last week. I wasn't taking any chances. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard footsteps outside my room, slow, deliberate. I got up and pressed my ear to the door. There was no knock, just a pause, and then the footsteps moved away. In the morning, the alarm clock was blinking. The power had gone out for exactly 1 minute. I checked the breaker. All the switches were fine. I didn't say a word to her at breakfast. She offered me coffee like nothing was wrong. I refused, then went back to the lawyer. This time I sat across from Mr. Holt and handed him the pictures, the refinancing documents, and the copies of the deed. He looked through them one by one, nodding. She has no legal standing, he said. Her name is nowhere, and you've contributed financially and residentially for over 7 years. If she tries to evict you, she will lose. I asked if I could file a preemptive claim. He nodded. We'll draft a notice of co-ownership and prepare a legal response to any false claims. If she serves you with anything, we'll fire back immediately. I asked about the risk. He said, only if you lose your documents. Keep them safe and stay calm. I drove home with a new kind of silence in my chest. Not grief or fear, but focus. When I walked in, Clara was folding laundry on the sofa. She looked up and asked, "Did you go somewhere?" I told her, "Just needed some fresh air." She raised an eyebrow. "You seem awfully sure of yourself all of a sudden." I smiled and said, "I just remembered something important." She stared at me for a second, then said, "Well, I hope it doesn't complicate things." I opened the fridge and saw that my labeled food was back, the same handwriting. That night I heard her talking on the phone again in the guest room. Yeah, she's acting strange. I might have to move up the timeline. Another pause. If she finds that file, we're screwed. She didn't know I already had it. She didn't know the file was already with a lawyer, but now I was certain she was hiding something bigger than just a property dispute, and I was about to find out what. 3 days later, Clara hosted what she called a grieving gathering for Arthur's friends and coworkers. Something she announced casually over coffee, like it was a birthday brunch. Just a little closure, she said, pouring almond milk into her mug and ignoring the second one she'd set out next to it. She didn't ask for my help with the arrangements, which was fine. She had barely acknowledged me all week, except to ask that I keep the guest bathroom clean and not bring up personal matters if I spoke to anyone. I didn't argue. I didn't say anything. But I watched. I watched as she pulled out Arthur's old bar cart and stocked it like she was hosting a cocktail party, and how she filled the counter with mini quiches and imported crackers as if we hadn't just buried him. The first guest arrived just after 6, Kyle, Arthur's friend from work. gave me a long hug and whispered, "He talked about you all the time. Said you were the one person he could always count on." I nodded, holding back tears. Then others came. Neighbors, co-workers, some of Clara's Pilates friends. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Clara floated around the room like a gracious hostess, wine glass in hand, giving short speeches about Arthur's generosity and light. I stayed near the back wall, observing her, smiled at strangers while she ignored the fact she had gutted his room and thrown out his books. At one point, someone asked me how I was holding up. I said, "As well as can be expected, considering I still live here." The woman looked confused. I added, "Arthur and I co-owned the house. Clara is managing things now, but I'm still living here." Her eyebrows shot up. "Oh, I thought she said it was hers." I smiled politely. "Easy mistake." I saw Clara watching me from across the room. Her face was still smiling, but her eyes had changed tight and searching. She made her way over when things quieted down and said, "Can I talk to you for a moment?" I followed her into the hall. She closed the door behind us. "Are you trying to start something?" I said. I answered a question honestly. She took a step closer. "Don't play cute, Eleanor. These people don't need to know about paperwork." I crossed my arms. She stopped lying. She glared at me, then composed herself. "Look, this is delicate. These are people who cared about Arthur. They're here to support me." I said, "Then you might not want to serve wine in the house you're trying to erase him from." Her face flushed. "If you don't want to be here, you can leave." I smiled. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere." She moved closer, whispering just like she did at the funeral. "You think you're clever, Eleanor, but you have no idea how this works. I will make sure you regret staying." Then she walked back out with the same polite expression and greeted the next guest as if we hadn't just threatened each other in the hallway. For the rest of the night, I stayed quiet. I watched. I listened. I noticed one guest, a man in his 40s with a shaved head and a designer coat, staring at me as if trying to place me. He spoke briefly with Clara near the hallway and left early. Something about the way he moved cautious and low-key struck me. After everyone left, Clara cleaned up in silence. I didn't offer to help. She didn't ask. At midnight, I walked past the guest room and saw a manila folder in her open purse. It wasn't there before. I went back to my room, grabbed my phone, and took a silent picture through the crack in her door. The folder read, "Dr. B copies, Plan B." Later that night, I waited until I heard her in the shower. Then I slipped into the hall and opened the bag. Inside, there were several folders. One was for the house closing, and another was labeled E-Signatures 2023. I didn't take anything, I just took pictures. One file contained a screenshot of a will with a digital signature I didn't recognize. The bottom corner read, "Filed March 4th. Arthur passed away on February 2nd. He hadn't signed anything in March." I stood there, my breath frozen as the water shut off. I moved fast, closed her bag, went back to my room, and waited in silence as she walked past my hall, humming, wrapped in a robe. My hands were still shaking, but now I had more than just a deed. I had proof she was trying to take control. Something much bigger was happening, and tomorrow I was going to dig even deeper into what the E-Signatures 2023 were supposed to cover. The next morning, I woke to the sound of crying in the kitchen. Not loud sobs, but a delicate, quiet weeping that was meant to be overheard. And when I walked in, Clara was standing by the sink in her robe, a tissue crumpled in her hand, staring out the window like she was in a soap opera. But as soon as she saw me, she turned and wiped under her eyes with the back of her hand, forcing a smile as if she were being brave for someone, and said, "Sorry, it just hits me all over again sometimes." And then she put a hand on her stomach, not dramatically, but just enough for me to notice. I froze because this was new. She looked up and said quietly, "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. I'm pregnant, Eleanor." And for 5 seconds, I couldn't speak. I couldn't move, because it made no sense. Not after everything I had seen, and not with the timing. I asked, "How far along are you?" And she answered quickly, 8 weeks, maybe 9. And that's what clinched it. Because Arthur had been gone for 10 weeks. I just stared at her, trying not to show the alarm ripping through my chest as she walked over and placed the sonogram picture on the table like it was a trump card. I picked it up, turned it slowly, and looked at the corner, her name, the clinic, and the date stamped in black ink. Not from 10 weeks ago, but from 4. And I knew right then that the pregnancy had nothing to do with Arthur. It had everything to do with control. And she said, "I used a donor. Arthur and I had talked about it, just in case. He wanted me to have a piece of him." And I knew, in that instant, it was a lie. That Arthur would have told me something that big. I looked at her and said nothing. I just handed the picture back without a reaction. And she added, "I hope you can understand now why it's so important for me to have stability for the baby's sake." And then it hit me. She was creating a compassion narrative. Something she could use in court if it came to that. The grieving widow expecting a child, forced to share a house with an unstable mother-in-law. I nodded slowly, and I told her that changed things. Her face softened, like she believed I was giving in, like her little performance had worked. But as soon as she left the room, I grabbed my phone, pulled up the picture I'd taken of the document in her purse, and compared the sonogram date to the file date. They were 4 days apart, both from the same week, both planted as evidence. I forwarded them to Mr. Holt with a short message. "We need to talk." And in less than an hour, he called me back and said, "This helps us if she claims dependency or emotional hardship. We can compel her to show medical records and the timeline's consistency." And I asked, "And if she faked the whole thing?" And he said, "Then it's fraud. And if you keep calmly documenting it, we will win before it ever gets to a trial." And I said, "She's trying to provoke me into a reaction." And he answered, "Then don't." And I didn't. I stayed quiet. I cleaned the bathroom. I folded laundry. I smiled when she made comments like, "This baby is going to need a lot of space," or, "It's going to be hard raising a child in a hostile environment." And every time she looked at me, it was like she was calculating how close I was to snapping. I just nodded and kept quiet until that Friday, when an envelope was slid under my door, a manila folder, with a 48-hour urgent notice typed on it. And inside was a typed-up document, clearly not filed with any court, stating I had 48 hours to vacate the property due to emotional instability and personal threats. I stood there staring at it, my heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of the sheer clumsiness of her handing me a lie I could disprove with a single email. And as I reread it, I noticed one last line at the bottom that made my blood run cold. If I did not leave, law enforcement would be involved, and she could file a claim for elder abuse. And that was it. That was the card she decided to play. She was going to frame me as a dangerous old woman in court, unstable and violent, even though I'd done nothing but make toast and fold towels. And now she was forcing a move, creating a panic, hoping I'd run before I fought back. And I knew what I had to do. I had to stop waiting for her to cross the line, because she already had. I didn't say a word after I read that fake eviction notice. I just folded it slowly, put it in a new folder with the other documents Clara had conveniently gifted me over the past 2 weeks. And I went straight to Mr. Holt's office. No appointment, no delay. Because this wasn't about defending my right to live in the house anymore. It was about dismantling the fantasy world she was trying to build. And when I sat across from him and handed him the newest file, his eyes scanned down to the last line, and he actually chuckled, not out of amusement, but disbelief, and said, "She's threatening you with elder abuse charges, while you're the one being emotionally harassed, documented, and financially manipulated." And I told him everything: the fake pregnancy timeline, the IVF clinic tag, the donor date, the doctored photos, the phone calls I overheard at night, and the conversations I baited her into without ever raising my voice. And he said, "We're past civil conflict now. This is pre-fraud litigation territory, and if she's altered financial documents or used your identity in any way, we could be looking at criminal charges." I asked him, "What's the fastest way to prove it?" He replied, "We request a subpoena for discovery on her digital records, emails, text logs, medical submissions, and bank data." I asked, "Will a judge grant it?" He answered, "If we show the falsified eviction, the pregnancy inconsistency, and the misrepresentation of the property deed, all documented, we don't just have a case, We have leverage. I just sat there, breathing, with the feeling that, for the first time since Arthur died, I wasn't just surviving, I was about to turn the tables on the person who thought she could erase me. On the way home, I stopped at a print shop and had 3 bound copies made of everything the deed with my name. The refinancing record, the sonogram with the fake date, the eviction threat text, the names of everyone who saw her try to rewrite the history of the house during the grieving gathering, and I labeled the file on the binder's spine Madison. Then, I put 1 copy in my safety deposit box, 1 at my lawyer's office, and 1 under the floorboards in my closet, where she'd never find it even if she tore the house apart. And when I got home that night, she was in the kitchen on a video call, earbuds in, laughing her head off about some new real estate opportunity. And she said to the person on the screen, "Yeah, I'll have access to the house in 2 weeks." And I froze behind the wall, realizing she wasn't just trying to win the house out of grief or insecurity. She was flipping it, maybe even planning to sell it, which meant she wouldn't even stay here long term. She just wanted the property rights for her own gain. I walked into the room, and I made sure she saw me. I didn't say anything. I went to the refrigerator, got a bottle of water, and stared at her until she ended the call. She turned slowly and said, "Do you need something?" I said, "Just a heads up, if another envelope shows up at my door, make sure it has a court seal on it. Anything less goes straight to my lawyer." She blinked fast like I'd slapped her, and then said, "Are you threatening me now?" I replied, "You started the paperwork war, Clara. I'm just keeping mine legal." And I walked away before she could answer. And that night, I did one last thing. I opened Arthur's old email account, the one he'd shared access to when I helped him with his job search years ago, and the password, his favorite song lyric, and his service number still worked. And what I found wasn't much, mostly job applications and bills, but then I found a folder marked Estate, and inside were PDF files, including one labeled Will Draft Feb 2023. And when I opened it, my breath caught, because the signature at the bottom didn't match his handwriting. The notary stamp was cropped and reused. And worst of all, the document listed Clara as the sole heir and owner, with no mention of me, even though the date was a week before he died. I printed it without touching anything else, heart pounding, realizing this was it. This was what she was trying to hide, the file. She must have buried it in the folder I saw in her purse, and this version had metadata on it from her computer's name. It wasn't Arthur's or a law firm's, just Madison K. Drafts. I sent the file directly to Mr. Holt and wrote, "She forged his will." I didn't even flinch as I hit send. The next morning, Holt called before I finished my toast. His voice, calm but firm, said, "We file today." And that was the moment everything shifted from quiet defense to active offense. Because now we had digital proof of forgery, evidence of intent to defraud, and proof of doctored legal documents with a traceable digital signature. He walked me through the next steps. File a motion to freeze any transfer of the property title. Request a judicial review of the entire will. File a fraud alert with the probate court, and place a protective notice on the house to stop any unauthorized sale or refinancing attempts. And he added, "You don't have to notify her, the court will." And I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, because finally someone else would speak for me, and I wouldn't have to keep pretending to be helpless in the house I helped pay for. And by noon that day, Clara must have sensed a shift because she became weirdly friendly. She offered to make lunch and asked if I wanted to help her shop for baby things. And when I said no, she tilted her head and asked, "Is everything okay?" I just smiled and said, "We'll see." And that afternoon, while she was out, I got a call from a process server who said, "We'll be delivering some documents later today. Don't get involved." And I said, "Trust me, I won't." And I sat on the couch with the blinds open and waited. And around 5 o'clock in the evening, she pulled into the driveway in her new SUV, 2 shopping bags in hand. And as soon as she stepped onto the porch, a man in a gray jacket got out of his car, walked up the steps, and said her full name in a clean, practiced tone. She paused, confused, and said, "Yes." And he handed her a thick envelope and said, "You've been served probate fraud and property lien." And she blinked, her lips parted, and asked, "What the hell is this?" And he said, "You'll have to read it." And he walked away without another word. And I watched her from the living room window, holding the envelope like it was heavy, staring at the seal, and then her eyes shot to the house to me. And I didn't move, didn't blink. I just sat there until she came inside with quick steps and slapped the envelope on the dining room table, ripped it open, scanned the first page, then the second, and I heard her whisper, "No, no, no." And then, louder, "He's lying. This is all lies." She turned to me and screamed, "What did you tell them?" I stood up and said, "I didn't tell them anything the documents did." She threw the envelope on the floor and stormed into the kitchen, muttering, "I'll fix this. This isn't happening." I didn't say anything, because she wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the world that had finally told her no. And that night, she didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't even leave her room. And the next morning, I found her pacing in the front yard, on the phone with someone, whispering, "Get me a lawyer who knows how to bury this." And then, I don't care what it costs, she's just some old woman. And I stood on the porch with my arms crossed, letting her know I heard every word. And 2 days later, the court date was set. A preliminary hearing to establish the validity of the will and the ownership of the deed. And when we arrived, Clara walked in wearing a cream-colored blazer, holding her fake sonogram picture like a prop, and her lawyer started with a soft-spoken performance about widowhood, grief, and maternal protection. But Holt tore it apart with hard evidence. Comparisons of Arthur's real signature to the one she'd submitted herself, metadata records from her laptop proving she'd opened and edited the document herself, plus the refinancing records. That cut her out of it completely. And then came the key point. The deed with my name on it, and the receipts, legally recorded, with no amendments or manipulation by Clara. And when Holt said, "Your Honor, my client has been a co-owner of this property since day one," the judge leaned forward, reviewed the file, and said, "Counselor, this is crystal clear." I watched Clara's posture crumble, her shoulders sinking and her mouth tightening, like she wanted to scream but couldn't. And then the judge said, "The temporary freeze on the property is lifted. Miss Allen retains co-ownership, legally. All eviction claims are void. As for the will, that is subject to a fraud investigation." Clara's lawyer whispered something fast, and she looked at him like he'd betrayed her. And I just stood there firm, silent, strong, because this wasn't a victory. It was just the truth finally being said out loud. On the way out of the courtroom, Holt turned to me and said, "Now we see if she fights it or packs her bags." As I got into my car, I checked my phone. I saw an email from the court system confirming the full property ownership recognition. I smiled, not out of spite, but relief, because she could spin stories and fake photos all she wanted. But now the law knew who she really was. The house was too quiet the next morning, not peaceful, but charged, like the silence before a storm. And when I walked into the kitchen, Clara was already there, dressed in black, like she was going to another funeral, sitting at the table with her coffee untouched, and a notepad in front of her full of names and phone numbers. And she didn't look up when I came in, just said, "You think you've won?" I poured my coffee without answering, letting her fill the silence with her own unraveling. And she went on, "You think just because you got some judge to believe your story that this is over?" And I finally turned and said, "It wasn't a story, Clara, it was the law." And that got her, because she stood up so fast, the chair shrieked against the tile, and she said, "You can't just steal everything from me." And I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You tried to erase me from a house I helped build, from a life I was always a part of, and you used a fake will and a fake pregnancy to do it." She froze, her mouth open, and tried to pivot, saying, "I was grieving, but I didn't buy it, not anymore, because the drama was dead and we both knew it." And I said, "Get your things. I'm showing you the same respect you never showed me. I'm still not calling the sheriff." Her mouth opened like she was going to scream, but she snapped it shut, grabbed her phone, and stormed out of the house. I sat down and sipped my coffee, finally tasting it without fear in my throat. And for the next few hours, the house stayed quiet, not just on the surface, but inside me, like the first breath after months underwater. I went into Arthur's old room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the empty bookshelf, the walls he painted himself. And I said quietly, "We're okay now, honey. I promise." And then I opened the top drawer, the one I hadn't touched since the funeral, and I found something unexpected. A folded piece of paper, handwritten, unsigned in his script, dated 3 weeks before he died, and it started with, "If anything happens to me, I want you to know, I'm sorry." And I felt a knot in my chest as I read line after line of guilt, frustration, and regret for how he'd let Clara isolate him from people. How he knew she was manipulative but was trying to fix it. How he felt like he couldn't tell me things anymore because she made him feel like he had to choose sides, and at the bottom of the letter it said, "Don't let her take everything. This house was always ours, not hers. Do what you have to do, Mom." And my hands started to shake, not from grief, but from clarity, because even in death, he had tried to give me the last word. I took the letter, scanned it to my phone, and put it in my drawer next to the deed. And around sunset, Clara came back, her face a mask of rage, and said, "You're going to regret this. I'm going to the press. I'll tell them you bullied a grieving widow." And I said, "Then I'll show them the sonogram dates, the will metadata, and the letter Arthur left me." And she went pale, like she'd seen a ghost because she didn't know about that last part. And she whispered, "You're bluffing." And I said, "Try me." And she turned and left, slamming the door so hard a picture frame fell off the hallway wall. And I didn't even flinch. I just picked up the frame, put it back, and made dinner like it was any other night. And while the pasta boiled, I texted Holt, "Found a personal letter that reinforces motive, will forward." And he replied in seconds, "Send that bulletproof." And that night, for the first time in months, I slept with the window open, no door wedge, no spare key under my pillow, just silence and fresh air. And in the morning, I heard boxes being packed. On Sunday morning, the hallway outside Clara's room was lined with cardboard boxes, some labeled, some not, some with tape barely holding the flaps together, as if she packed in a rage. And I didn't ask if she was really leaving, because I already knew she was out of legal cards. And whatever delusion she was clinging to had collapsed under the weight of court documents and her own arrogance. And when she came into the kitchen, she didn't speak at first, just opened a drawer like she was looking for something that was never there. She finally turned to me and said, "I'll be out by Friday." I nodded. No smile, no sarcasm, just calm, like it was a logistics meeting and not the end of a month-long war. And she added, "You can have your house back." And I said, "It was never yours to give." And that hit her harder than yelling because she froze for a second. Then she looked away like she wanted to spit something, but couldn't find a word that wouldn't choke her on the way out. And I walked past her and put the kettle on, not for drama, but because I actually wanted tea, and I had already learned that the most powerful thing I had left was to not react, to just keep living like she was already gone. And later that afternoon, she had 2 friends over who were whispering loudly in the hall, helping her lift boxes. And I stayed in my room as they whispered things like, "She's insane, and how did you even live here with her?" And I didn't say a word because those weren't questions worth answering. And the next morning, she tried one last pathetic play. She called Kyle, an old friend of Arthur's, and left him a voicemail saying that I had fabricated the entire case, that Arthur never wanted me in the house, and that I was using elder abuse tactics to take everything. And what she didn't know was that Kyle had already spoken to me, that he had already seen the court documents and the letter Arthur wrote, and that he forwarded me the message right after he got it with just one line, "She's desperate." And I didn't reply, because there was nothing left to say. And by Thursday, her car was packed with the last of her things. Her face was pale. Makeup was smudged under her eyes like she'd finally realized this wasn't just a legal loss. It was personal, it was public, and it was permanent. And that morning she came to the door with her last bag in her hand and said, "You don't have to do this." And I said, "Neither did you." And she flinched like she wasn't expecting that answer, like she wanted me to get dramatic, maybe yell or cry, or give her one more reason to tell the world I was the villain. But I just stood there still and quiet, watching her process the truth in real time, that she had played every card, called every bluff, and had ended up exactly where she started, standing on a porch that never belonged to her, with a future she couldn't sell. I opened the door and said, "You have until midnight." And she asked, "Where am I supposed to go?" I looked her in the eye and said, Anywhere that isn't here. And then I closed the door, not to be cruel, but to be finished. And I watched from the window as she stood on the porch for a full minute, frozen, before she finally walked to her car, slammed the trunk shut, and drove away without looking back. And I didn't cry, I didn't cheer, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt exhausted. And as the sun set, I turned off the porch light, locked the front door, and for the first time in months allowed myself to sit in silence without listening for footsteps or watching my back, because she was finally gone and the house was mine again, clean, and without anyone left to claim it. And I thought that was the end until I walked into the living room and saw the small flash drive she'd left on the coffee table, unlabeled silver, just sitting there like bait, and my stomach turned because Clara never left anything behind unless she wanted it to be found. I stared at the flash drive on the coffee table for a long time, not touching it, not moving it, because I knew Clara hadn't left it by accident, not after everything she'd done, not when every move she made was calculated and coded in fake sincerity. And I thought about leaving it alone, throwing it out, pretending it didn't exist. But after everything I had survived, I wasn't going to end this story with a loose end. So I plugged it into Arthur's old laptop, the one she never touched because she said it smelled like dust and grief. And I waited for the screen to light up, one folder, no password, just a file labeled Open Me, and inside was a video, grainy at first, then clearer as the camera stabilized, showing Clara sitting in Arthur's office. The same chair I used to check my email that morning. She looked directly into the webcam and said, "If you're watching this, either I'm gone or you think you've won." Her tone was calm but smug, like she was still playing chess in her head, and she continued, "I did what I had to do, and maybe I crossed some lines, but you were never supposed to stay here forever, Eleanor. You were a placeholder, a guest who overstayed their welcome." And then she leaned forward, her eyes fixed and her voice low. "Arthur wanted to ask you to leave before he died. He just didn't have the guts to say it." And I paused the video, my jaw tight, my heart racing, because even now she was trying to plant doubt, trying to claw at the one thing she could never accept, my bond with my son. But I hit play again and watched as she said, "I told him we could build something if we just had space, if he could finally let go of the past, but he was weak. He couldn't cut the cord, so I had to do it for him." And then she smiled like it was some kind of victory, as if isolating him from me was an act of love instead of control. And she ended the video with, "You can have the house, Eleanor, but you'll never unhear this." And the screen went black. I just sat there for a moment, in the silence that followed, not angry, not even surprised, because this was who she always was, controlling, cruel, always needing the last word. But what she didn't know was that I already had the only thing that mattered, Arthur's handwritten letter, the one she could never fake or overwrite, the one where he said, "I'm sorry," and told me the truth she'd spent months trying to hide. And I took that letter out of the drawer, held it up next to the frozen image of her face on the laptop, and I felt peace, because in the end, this wasn't about proving who was right, it was about surviving long enough to watch her lose control. I pulled out the flash drive, dropped it in the trash, and deleted the file from the laptop, not because I was afraid of her lies, but because I didn't need any more reminders. The war was over, the house was silent, and every room was finally mine again. And that night, I unpacked my last few things from the boxes she'd labeled for her move out. I put Arthur's picture back on the sewing table in the entryway, I lit a candle in the kitchen, and I sat, alone at the table, not feeling lonely. Just still, just present, just free, and as I sipped my tea and listened to the quiet that no longer held tension or fear, I looked out the window at the porch she once tried to claim, and I whispered, "My house, my rules," and I smiled because for the first time since the funeral, I could breathe in a space that was completely my own, not because I fought for it, but because I never let her take it from me.